now for Part 3 of 1984. Part 3 of the novel takes place in the Ministry of Love. O'Brien is a member of the Inner Party, and he's the one that's in charge of Winston's reintegration. He tells Winston, "I shall save you, make you perfect." This perfection will first be achieved through the reclamation of Winston's body and mind, but will not be complete until he willingly surrenders his heart to Big Brother. Yeah, it ends with the heart, but that probably doesn't surprise you if you watch the first two videos on 1984. You will find in Part 3 that many of the arguments that O'Brien makes sound like they come right out of the mouths of the conditioners in C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man. Winston's cure begins with his mind. O'Brien tells Winston that he is mentally deranged, and that his lunacy is in his belief that reality is something objective, external, existing in its own right. That right there sounds like Orwell has just had a few pints with C.S. Lewis, doesn't it? Winston's sanity can be restored only when he accepts, intellectually, the party's assertion that there is no objective reality. Although Winston resists, O'Brien, in concert with the use of physical torture, reclaims Winston's mind by reasserting the ideas of doublethink and the mutability of the past. In essence, he attacks the Tao that Winston has been working to reclaim. O'Brien produces the photograph of the three men accused of treason, the picture which Winston held years before, which was for him objective evidence that the party had lied, evidence that the past was real. O'Brien burns the picture and declares that it never existed. Winston objects that he remembers it, but again O'Brien claims that he does not. O'Brien's ability to apply doublethink crushed him like a bludgeon. Still, Winston holds on to the idea that he's right. So O'Brien chastises him for his lack of discipline. "I tell you, Winston, that reality is not external. Reality exists in the human mind and nowhere else. Not in the individual mind, which can make mistakes, and in any case soon perishes, only in the mind of the party, which is collective and immortal. Whatever the party holds to be true is the truth." O'Brien then illustrates this idea using Winston's assertion that 2 + 2 necessarily equals 4. Through continuous torture and intensive questioning, using the body against the mind, Winston, for perhaps 30 seconds, sees 5 fingers. The absolute power that the party seeks can be attained only through the elimination of objective reality. They must overthrow the Tao. Once disposed of, it can be as O'Brien declares. The party's control over matter will be absolute. The party will make the laws of nature. Once this is accepted, anything is possible. Invisibility, levitation, anything. O'Brien contends that reality is inside the skull, that nothing exists except through human consciousness. Then you can have absolute power if you control the minds of all the people. That's why Winston's so important. O'Brien concludes, real power is not over things, but over men. This is just what Lewis says. What we call man's power over nature turns out to be a power exercised by some men over other men with nature as its instrument. Ultimately, Winston's mind cannot resist the effects of physical torture combined with brainwashing techniques. But he hoped to keep the inner heart inviolate. He knows his head will follow his body, but will the chest survive? Orwell's notion of humanity is consistent with that of Lewis. It is by the middle element that man is man. So Winston's chest, his heart, emotions, sentiments, this was the final conquest of the party. For the party to have absolute power, Winston must surrender his inner heart of his own free will. But Winston is not ready to surrender this vital part of himself, and he insists that the party will be defeated because of it. When pressed, he invokes the idea of the spirit of man. O'Brien asks Winston if he considers himself a man, and Winston says he does. And this is when O'Brien declares him to be the last man. He makes Winston strip and stand in front of a mirror, and what he sees frightens him. A bowed, gray-colored, skeleton-like thing. O'Brien comments on the last man. "You are rotting away. You are falling to pieces. What are you? A bag of filth. Do you see that thing facing you? That is the last man. If you are human, that is humanity." Winston has been defeated physically and intellectually. His mind is in the same state as his body. He accepted everything. The past was alterable. The past had never been altered. He remembered remembering contrary things, but those were false memories, products of self-deception. How easy it all was. Only surrender, and everything else followed. He hardly knew why he had rebelled. Everything was easy, except that Winston's cure was not yet complete. Winston continues to dream, and his dreams take him into landscapes of beauty, and to these are connected unrepentant emotions. The Tao still asserts itself. On one such occasion, he heard himself cry aloud, "Julia, Julia, Julia, my love, Julia." He's fragmented because one part of him remains human. His retrained intellect knows that he's in the wrong, but by his emotions he wants to be wrong. He knows he is to be executed, but he will defeat the party in the end by dying, hating them. O'Brien is aware that although Winston is intellectually healthy, emotionally there is still something wrong with him. Winston is now ready for the final step in his cure. In room 101. There is little doubt as to the terror and the effects of a visit to room 101. We saw this before with the skull-faced man. When he was summoned there, he said, "I got a wife and 3 kids. The biggest isn't 6 years old. You can take the whole lot of them and cut their throats in front of my eyes, and I'll stand by and watch it, but not room 101. All these things go directly against the universal morality that says we are to protect our family. It goes against the Tao. The purpose of room 101 is the destruction of objective reality and this universal morality. It's the annihilation of the Tao, and consequently, the annihilation of humanity. It is in room 101 that Winston's unhealthy emotions will be treated. To conquer the chest and to purge him of his noble sentiments, Winston will be exposed to the worst thing in the world. For Winston, the worst thing in the world is rats. While with Julia in the room above Mr. Charrington's shop, Winston reacts in horror at the sighting of a rat, and then Julia explains, "In the streets, a woman daren't leave her baby alone for 2 minutes. Because of the rats." In room 101, O'Brien produces a cage that is designed to fit over Winston's face, and it contains huge rats. O'Brien explains that rats show astonishing intelligence in knowing when a human being is helpless. Just before the cage of rats is put over Winston's face, the rats start trying to get at each other through the partition. They are willing to eat members of their own species. This represents the unbridled, anti-Tao desires of the animal nature. So the rats are a key element in this final stage of Winston's defeat in room 101. Winston's discovery of the Tao begins with the self-sacrificial nature of that gesture of the woman in the flick, the gesture that was so significant to Winston. It so happens that his mother executed the same gesture the last time that he saw her. Obviously, he's haunted by his subconscious awareness of his moral failings as a child. In the end, his mother broke off 3/4 of the chocolate and gave it to Winston, giving the other quarter to his sister. Winston stood watching her for a moment. Then with a sudden swift spring, he had snatched the piece of chocolate out of his sister's hand and was fleeing for the door. The mother drew her arms round the child and pressed its face against her breast. Something in the gesture told him that his sister was dying. He turned and fled down the stairs. He never saw his mother again. Winston deep down believes himself responsible for his mother's and his sister's deaths. The description of the behavior of rats provided by O'Brien and Julia are from Winston's perspective consistent with his behavior as a child. Although his mother had already given him most of the chocolate, he allows his hunger to overpower the moral and ethical requirements of the Tao. He behaves very rat-like when he takes and eats the food that was meant to be eaten by his starving sister. Symbolically, he is eating her alive. With Julia, Winston has been able to redeem his past. In spite of the torture of both his mind and his body, he has remained loyal to her. As the rat cage comes closer to his face, Winston attempts to invoke the intellect. To think was the only hope. Lewis says that the heart never takes the place of the head, but it can and should obey it. But under these circumstances, Winston's mind no longer has the ability to rule. The appetites are in control. In room 101, the party uses his greatest fear to force him to abandon what he knows is good and right. In here, with the rats being placed onto his face, he interposes the body of Julia between him and the rats. In effect, he sacrifices her to save himself. He's guilty of betraying the precepts of the Tao. She's a human sacrifice, her life for his. So Winston has failed a second time, and this time he no longer has the excuse of being a selfish child. O'Brien has engineered the destruction of all that remains human in Winston. The appetites destroyed the noble sentiment, and the animal nature is all that remains. Winston has now become an obedient instrument of the party. Living within the Tao, humanity has a sense of limits, a conception of the imperative, "thou shalt not," and "thou shalt." But the party has rejected the Tao. As O'Brien states, our command is "thou art." O'Brien claims on behalf of the party that we create human nature. Humanity is the party. So the party conditioners have indeed become what Lewis calls the man-molders, who are armed with the powers of an omnicompetent state and an irresistible scientific technique, who really can cut out all posterity in what shape they please. With the destruction of Winston, the party has apparently won the war. But Lewis would ask who precisely will have won it. When an artificial Tao is imposed on humanity, it is in fact nature that has won the war. Rather than achieving absolute power, the party has lost it all. The party has taken the final step of reducing humanity to the level of mere nature. In the absence of the Tao, the conditioners must come to be motivated simply by their own pleasure. Their pleasure is to value reason over everything else. The party does the same thing by desiring power over everything else. But there is no rational basis to value one of these over the others. And so because reason isn't involved, the choice is really being made by our gut or our natural impulses, by nature. So if any one of those succeeds in achieving primacy over the rest, it is nature that will have won, and human beings that will have lost. In the absence of the Tao, nature rules the conditioners. It rules the party, and through them, all of humanity. Man's conquest of nature turns out, in the moment of its consummation, to be nature's conquest of man. Thank you, and we'll see you next time.